Excuse me. Excuse me. You are on HOA property without authorization. See that driveway? That lawn? They belong to the Ridgeview Hills Homeowners Association, and you are trespassing.
Sorry, I was just...
Trespassing. I am calling the police right now unless you comply with our regulations immediately.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Karen Stories. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you the most unbelievable tales of entitled behavior and the people who stand up to it. Today's story is about a retired veteran who bought his dream home specifically to avoid HOA drama, only to have an HOA Karen literally try to claim he was trespassing on his own land. I'm talking forged documents, police calls, threats, and a scheme so corrupt it ended with arrests. Let's dive in. Our protagonist today is someone we'll call James Mitchell, though that's not his real name. He values his privacy. James is 67 years old, a retired Navy veteran who spent 25 years serving his country before transitioning to a successful career in civil engineering. After decades of following orders, dealing with regulations, and living in structured environments, James wanted one thing for his retirement: peace, quiet, and absolute freedom to do whatever he wanted with his own property. James had heard the horror stories about HOAs. Friends had told him about being fined for the wrong shade of mailbox paint. Neighbors reported for parking their own cars in their own driveways, and retirees harassed over lawn ornaments. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. So when he started house hunting in the suburbs outside Richmond, Virginia, his #1 requirement, even above square footage or school districts, was simple: no HOA. His real estate agent understood the assignment. She showed him dozens of properties, but James kept coming back to one particular house. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch-style home on a 1-acre lot at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The house had been built in 1985, long before the surrounding neighborhood development that had an HOA. The property had mature trees, a spacious backyard perfect for the garden James wanted to plant, and, most importantly, it was located just outside the boundaries of any homeowners association. James did his due diligence. He reviewed the property deed, checked the county records, confirmed the lot lines, and verified with his real estate attorney that the property was definitively not part of any HOA. The title search came back clean. There were no covenants, conditions, or restrictions attached to the deed. It was a completely independent property, which was exactly what James wanted. He closed on the house in early September, paying cash from his retirement savings. Moving day was a dream. James hired movers to handle the heavy lifting while he directed traffic, imagining all the projects he'd finally have time for. He planned to build a workshop in the garage, plant a vegetable garden, maybe get a dog, and generally enjoy the freedom of retirement without anyone telling him what color his front door could be or how tall his grass was allowed to grow. The first week in the new house was perfect. James unpacked at his own pace, set up his furniture exactly how he wanted it, and spent his mornings drinking coffee on the back patio watching the sunrise over his own private piece of land. He met a few neighbors, pleasant people who welcomed him to the area and seemed genuinely friendly. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, who lived 2 houses down, even brought over a homemade apple pie and warned him, in a joking tone, to watch out for the HOA lady from the neighborhood next door. James laughed it off at the time. His property wasn't in an HOA, so what did he have to worry about? He was about to find out. The first encounter. It was a Saturday morning, 10 days after James moved in. He was in his front yard, measuring out a space where he wanted to build a small flower bed near the mailbox. The weather was perfect: cool autumn air, bright sunshine, and absolutely peaceful. James was wearing old jeans and a Navy veteran t-shirt, completely absorbed in his project, when he heard a car pull up. He looked up to see a sleek black Lexus SUV stopping at the end of his driveway. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked straight out of a speak to the manager stereotype convention. This was Karen Miller. Karen was in her early 50s with that distinctive blonde bob haircut that seemed to be standard issue for entitled suburbanites. She wore designer athleisure wear, expensive yoga pants, a fitted jacket with a luxury brand logo, and pristine white sneakers that had clearly never seen an actual gym. Oversized sunglasses perched on top of her head, and she carried a leather-bound clipboard like it was a weapon. She marched up James's driveway with the confidence of someone who believed she owned the place. And in her mind, she probably did. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Are you the new owner of this property?" James straightened up, his back protesting slightly from bending over. He smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. James Mitchell. I just moved in last week. Can I help you with something?" Karen didn't return the smile. She stopped about 10 feet away, looked him up and down with an expression that suggested she'd found him lacking, and then consulted her clipboard. "I'm Karen Miller, president of the Ridgeview Hills Homeowners Association. I'm here to discuss your property's compliance with our community standards." James felt a flicker of confusion. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. This property isn't part of an HOA. I specifically purchased it because it's outside any HOA jurisdiction. I have the title documents to prove it." Karen's expression didn't change. In fact, she looked almost pleased that he'd brought it up, like she'd been expecting this exact response. "That information is outdated, Mr. Mitchell. Your property was recently annexed into the Ridgeview Hills HOA boundaries due to a newly amended plat map filed with the county. As of 6 months ago, this property falls under our jurisdiction." The confusion James felt turned to something closer to alarm. "I'm sorry, what? That's not possible. I had a title search done before closing. There were no HOAs, no restrictions, nothing." "Well, your title search was incomplete," Karen said dismissively, pulling a document from her clipboard and holding it out. "Here's a copy of the amended plat map and the annexation notice. Your property is located within the newly defined boundaries of Ridgeview Hills, and as such, you are required to comply with all HOA rules and regulations. You'll also need to pay the annual dues, which are $2,400, backdated to when the annexation took effect. That brings your current balance to," she consulted her clipboard, $1,200, representing the prorated amount for the past 6 months. James took the document she offered, scanning it quickly. It certainly looked official. It had a county seal, property lines, and a lot of legal language. But something felt wrong about this entire interaction. "Ms. Miller," said James carefully, "I'm going to need to review this with my attorney. I never agreed to join any HOA, and I have serious doubts about the legality of annexing a property without the owner's knowledge or consent." Karen's expression hardened. "Your consent isn't required, Mr. Mitchell. The annexation was approved by the county and is legally binding. Now I'm going to need you to remove that measuring tape and any plans for landscaping changes until you've submitted the proper architectural modification forms. All exterior changes must be approved by the HOA board before implementation." James felt his temper starting to rise, but his military training and staying calm under pressure kicked in. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm not submitting anything to your HOA because my property is not part of your HOA. I'm going to have my attorney look into this, and I'm sure we'll get it cleared up quickly." "You're making a mistake," Karen said, her voice taking on a threatening edge. "Non-compliance with HOA regulations results in fines. Continued non-compliance can result in liens against your property. I suggest you cooperate, Mr. Mitchell. This will go much easier if you simply accept the situation and follow the rules like everyone else. I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm going to ask you to leave my property now. I'll be in touch once I've consulted with my attorney." Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue further, but something in James's expression, perhaps the look of a man who had dealt with far more intimidating situations during his military career, made her think better of it. "Fine," she snapped, "but you've been officially notified. Any modifications you make to this property without HOA approval will result in immediate fines and legal action. Good day, Mr. Mitchell." She turned on her expensive sneakers and marched back to her Lexus, pulling away with just a bit more speed than was necessary for a residential street. James stood in his driveway, holding the document Karen had given him, feeling the peace of his retirement morning completely shattered. He looked down at the so-called annexation notice and felt a deep sense of unease. Something was very, very wrong here. Investigation begins. James went inside immediately and called his real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, who had handled his property closing. He explained the bizarre encounter he'd just had, and Linda's response was immediate and reassuring. "James, that sounds like complete nonsense," she said bluntly. "First of all, annexing a property into an HOA without the owner's consent is extremely difficult and requires specific legal procedures, including notice and, in most cases, agreement from the property owner. Second, we did a comprehensive title search before your closing. If there had been any changes to the HOA boundaries affecting your property, it would have shown up. Can you scan and send me the document she gave you?" James used his phone to photograph the annexation notice and emailed it to Linda. He heard her keyboard clicking as she pulled it up on her computer. There was a long pause. "Okay," Linda said slowly. "This document has some major red flags. The county seal looks legitimate, but the formatting is off. The case number doesn't follow the standard county format, and the signature... I'm going to need to verify this with the county clerk's office, but I'm 95% sure this is a forgery." "A forgery?" James repeated. "She forged county documents?" "Possibly," Linda said, "or someone did. Let me make some calls. In the meantime, do not, and I cannot stress this enough, do not pay any fees to this HOA, do not sign any documents they give you, and do not acknowledge any authority they claim to have over your property. If she comes back, politely but firmly tell her that all communication needs to go through your attorney. And here's my contact information." Linda gave James her office number and email, then added, "I'll call you back within 48 hours. I'm going to pull the actual county records and see what's really going on here." James thanked her and hung up, feeling a mixture of relief that he had professional help and anger that he was being forced to deal with this nonsense in the first place. He'd bought this house specifically to avoid HOA drama, and now he was apparently dealing with an HOA that was trying to fraudulently claim authority over his property. He decided to do some investigating of his own. James walked down the street to Frank's house, the friendly neighbor who'd brought him the apple pie and made the joke about the HOA lady. Frank answered the door with a welcoming smile that faded when he saw James's expression.
"Everything okay, James? Frank, you mentioned the HOA lady from the neighborhood next door. Was that Karen Miller you were talking about?" Frank's expression turned serious. "Yeah, that's her. She came by to talk to you already, huh?" "She just showed up in my driveway claiming my property was annexed into her HOA," said James. "She tried to tell me I owe $1,200 in backdated dues and that I can't make any changes to my property without her approval." Frank sighed heavily and gestured for James to come inside. "You better come in. We need to talk." Over coffee at Frank's kitchen table, James learned some disturbing information. Frank, it turned out, was 72 years old and had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 30 years, long before the Ridgeview Hills development had been built adjacent to their street. Frank's property, like James's, was not part of any HOA. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to be. Karen pulled the same thing with me about 2 years ago, showed up with some official-looking documents claiming my property had been annexed, demanded I pay dues and follow their rules. I told her to take a hike, and she threatened me with fines and liens. "What happened?" James asked. "I hired a lawyer. Cost me $3,000, but it was worth it. We proved that the annexation documents were fraudulent. Karen had apparently worked with someone, we'd never figured out who, to create fake county records that made it look like properties on our street had been absorbed into the HOA boundaries. When we threatened to press charges for fraud and forgery, she backed off. But here's the thing, James. She didn't stop. She just moved on to other targets." "Other targets?" James felt his stomach sink. Frank nodded grimly. "There's a woman 3 streets over, elderly lady named Margaret. Carrie went after her even harder. Margaret didn't have the money to hire a lawyer, so she just gave in. Started paying the HOA dues even though her property isn't legally part of the HOA. Karen scared her into compliance." "That's extortion," said James. "Yes, it is," agreed Frank. "And there are at least 3 other properties I know of in similar situations. Karen targets people she thinks won't fight back. Elderly folks, people new to the area who don't know better, anyone who seems vulnerable. She uses intimidation and fake legal documents to force them into her HOA, and then she collects dues from them. Why would she do that? What's the point?" Frank shrugged. "Money, power, control, maybe all 3.
The Ridgeview Hills HOA has about 200 homes. If she can add even 10 or 15 outside properties paying $2,400 a year, that's an extra $30,000 to $40,000 coming in annually. Where that money goes, I have no idea, but I guarantee you it's not being spent on legitimate HOA purposes. James sat back, processing this information. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president on an ego trip. This was organized fraud.
The harassment escalates. Armed with this new information, James felt more prepared for whatever Karen might try next. He didn't have to wait long. 2 days after their first encounter, James came home from running errands to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It was an HOA violation notice, claiming that his lawn was inadequately maintained and that he had unauthorized decorative items visible from the street. The decorative items in question? 2 terracotta planters that James had placed on either side of his front steps, filled with mums he'd picked up at the garden center. The violation notice demanded immediate compliance and threatened a fine of $250 if the issues weren't corrected within 72 hours. James crumpled up the notice and threw it in the recycling bin. The next day, another notice appeared. This one claimed he had parked his truck in his driveway for excessive periods, which violated HOA parking regulations. James had literally parked his truck in his own driveway, where it sat overnight like any normal person's vehicle would. He called Linda, his attorney, and sent her photos of both notices. "This is harassment," Linda said flatly, "and it's going to help our case. Keep every single notice she gives you. Don't throw them away. We're going to need them as evidence. I'm still waiting on some information from the county, but I should have concrete proof that the annexation documents are fraudulent by the end of the week." James agreed to document everything, but the harassment was just getting started. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen escalated her tactics. She started showing up at James's property unannounced, usually with 1 or 2 other people she introduced as HOA compliance officers. These compliance officers, who were really just her cronies from the HOA board, would walk around James's property taking photographs and making notes on clipboards as if they had any legal authority to do so. The first time this happened, James was in his backyard working on his garden. He looked up to see Karen and 2 middle-aged men in polo shirts with Ridgeview HOA embroidered on them, standing in his yard without permission, photographing his garden beds. "Excuse me," James called out, walking toward them. "This is private property. I need you to leave." Karen looked up from her clipboard with that same condescending expression she'd worn during their first meeting. "We're conducting a routine compliance inspection, Mr. Mitchell. As an HOA board member, I have the authority." "You have no authority here," James interrupted, his voice firm. "This property is not part of your HOA. You are trespassing. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." One of the compliance officers, a balding man with a self-important air, stepped forward. "Sir, you need to understand that resisting HOA inspections can result in additional fines and—" "Get off my property," James said, each word deliberate and clear. His military bearing came through, shoulders back, posture commanding, voice brooking no argument. The 2 compliance officers glanced at each other nervously, clearly not used to people standing up to them, but Karen held her ground, her face reddening with anger. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Mitchell. The HOA has legal remedies for non-compliant homeowners, and I promise you we will use every single one of them. You think you can just ignore the rules because you're new here? That's not how this works." James pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police right now to report trespassing. You have 10 seconds to leave my property." Karen finally backed down, but not before shooting him a look of pure venom. "This isn't over," she hissed, then turned and marched off his property, her compliance officers hurrying after her. James did call the police, filing a formal trespassing report. The officer who took the report was sympathetic, but explained that unless Karen came back after being warned, there wasn't much they could do beyond documenting the incident. "We get a lot of HOA disputes," the officer said with a weary sigh. "Most of them are civil matters, but I'll make sure this report is on file in case you need it later." That night, James's doorbell rang at 9 p.m. He answered it to find a sheriff's deputy standing on his porch, looking apologetic.
Mr. Mitchell, I'm Deputy Rodriguez. I'm sorry to bother you, but we received a complaint that you threatened an HOA representative with violence earlier today. I need to ask you some questions. James's jaw tightened. Deputy, I did no such thing. What I did was ask Karen Miller and 2 other people to leave my property after they trespassed without permission. I have security cameras that recorded the entire interaction. The deputy's expression shifted to one of understanding. Would you mind if I reviewed that footage, sir? James invited him in and pulled up the security camera footage on his laptop. The video clearly showed Karen and her compliance officers entering his property without permission, James asking them to leave, and no threats of any kind being made. The deputy watched the whole thing and nodded. I figured as much, Deputy Rodriguez said. Ms. Miller has a reputation with our department. She files a lot of reports that don't pan out. I'll note in my report that the complaint was unfounded. I'm sorry you were bothered with this, sir. After the deputy left, James sat in his living room feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. It had been less than a month since he'd moved into his dream retirement home, and instead of enjoying peace and quiet, he was dealing with harassment, trespassing, false police reports, and intimidation. But James had faced worse than Karen Miller during his military career. He wasn't going to be bullied off his own property by a suburban tyrant with a clipboard.
Building the case. Linda Chen, James's attorney, called him 3 days later with news. James, I've got confirmation from the county clerk's office. The annexation documents Karen Miller showed you are absolutely fraudulent. The county seal is fake, the case number doesn't exist in their system, and the clerk's signature is forged. I've got a sworn statement from the county clerk confirming all of this. So we can prove she's committing fraud, James said. Better than that, Linda replied. I've been doing some digging into Karen Miller and the Ridgeview Hills HOA. Want to hear something interesting? The HOA's financial records show that they collect approximately $480,000 per year in dues from their 200 homes. But when I cross-reference that with county tax records and the HOA's corporate filings, there are discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? According to the HOA's own filed documents, they claim to have 225 homes paying dues. But the Ridgeview Hills development only has 200 homes. I verified this with the original plat maps from when it was built. So where are the extra 25 homes she's claiming? James understood immediately. Properties outside the HOA boundaries, properties she's fraudulently annexed. Exactly, Linda confirmed. She's been running this scam for years. She creates fake annexation documents, intimidates property owners into paying dues they don't legally owe, and pockets the extra income. I estimate she's collecting an extra $60,000 per year from fraudulent dues alone. But where's that money going? James asked. The HOA has to file financial reports, right? They do, Linda said, and that's where it gets even more interesting. I pulled the HOA's tax filings and corporate records. There's a management company called HOA Property Solutions that the HOA pays almost $80,000 per year for management services and compliance enforcement. Guess who owns HOA Property Solutions? Karen Miller, James guessed. Close. Her husband, David Miller. It's a shell company. Karen runs the HOA, funnels money to her husband's company for fake services, and they pocket the cash. Between the fraudulent annexations and the shell company payments, they're probably stealing over $100,000 per year from the HOA and innocent homeowners. James felt a cold anger settling in his chest. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. Karen Miller was running a sophisticated fraud operation, and she'd been getting away with it for years. What do we do? He asked. We build an airtight case and we go to the authorities, Linda said. I'm going to need you to help me contact the other homeowners who've been targeted. Frank already agreed to cooperate, and we need to find everyone else Karen has victimized. The more victims we can document, the stronger our case becomes. I'm also going to contact the county district attorney's office. Forgery of government documents, fraud, extortion, these are serious criminal offenses. Over the next 3 weeks, James and Linda worked methodically to build their case. Frank helped identify 6 other property owners outside the HOA who'd been targeted by Karen. Some, like elderly Margaret, had been paying dues out of fear. Others had fought back and been harassed even worse than James. Each property owner provided statements, documentation, and evidence of Karen's fraud. Linda compiled everything into a comprehensive report that detailed the entire scheme: the forged documents, the intimidation tactics, the shell company, the financial fraud, all of it. Meanwhile, Karen continued her harassment campaign against James. She filed false noise complaints, claiming he was running power tools at inappropriate hours. She sent him increasingly threatening letters about accumulating fines that allegedly totaled over $3,000. She even showed up at his house with a fake lien notice that she claimed gave the HOA the right to foreclose on his property for non-payment of dues. James documented everything: every fake notice, every trespassing incident, every false police report. His security cameras captured every interaction. His files grew thicker by the day. And then Linda called with the news he'd been waiting for. "The district attorney's office is interested," Linda said, barely containing her excitement. "I met with an assistant DA named Rebecca Torres. She reviewed our evidence and agreed that there's sufficient probable cause to open a criminal investigation into Karen Miller and her husband. They're going to bring in the county sheriff's fraud investigation unit." "How long will that take?" James asked. "Could be weeks, could be months," Linda admitted. "But Rebecca did say one thing that I think you'll appreciate. She said if Karen continues to harass you or any of the other victims while the investigation is ongoing, it'll just add more charges to what she's already facing. So in a weird way, the more Karen digs herself deeper, the worse it's going to be for her." James allowed himself a grim smile. Karen had built her little empire on intimidation and fraud, assuming that her victims would be too scared, too confused, or too exhausted to fight back. She'd picked the wrong veteran to mess with.
The investigation intensifies. While the criminal investigation was beginning, Karen Miller remained blissfully unaware that her entire operation was about to come crashing down. In fact, she seemed to interpret James's continued resistance as a personal challenge that required escalation. She started showing up at James's property multiple times per week, always with her clipboard and her compliance officers, always taking photographs and making notes. She filed complaints with every county department she could think of: code enforcement, environmental services, even the health department, claiming James's garden was a mosquito breeding hazard. Every single complaint was investigated and found to be baseless. Every single time, James provided the investigating officials with documentation showing that he was in full compliance with actual county regulations and that Karen Miller had no legal authority over his property. The county code enforcement officer, a tired-looking man named Bill Stevens, actually apologized to James after the third frivolous complaint. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that we're aware Ms. Miller has been abusing our complaint system," Bill said. "We've started flagging complaints that come from her for additional review before we investigate them. Unfortunately, we're still legally required to respond to every complaint, but I can assure you that her credibility with our department is basically zero at this point."
"I appreciate that," James said. "Is there any way to stop her from filing these false reports?" Bill sighed. "We can issue a warning for abuse of the system, but beyond that, it's hard. The complaint system is designed to be accessible to anyone who has a legitimate concern. People like Miss Miller exploit that. But," he added with a slight smile, "I did hear through the grapevine that the DA's office is looking into her activities. That true?" "I couldn't say," James replied diplomatically. Bill nodded knowingly. "Well, if it is true, I hope they throw the book at her. I've been dealing with her nonsense for 3 years, and she's wasted hundreds of hours of county staff time with frivolous complaints and fake emergencies." As the investigation progressed behind the scenes, James' attorney, Linda, stayed in close contact with the assistant district attorney. Rebecca Torres, the ADA handling the case, was methodical and thorough. She interviewed each victim personally, reviewed every piece of evidence, and worked with forensic document examiners to prove the county documents were forged. She also did something James hadn't expected. She subpoenaed the Ridgeview Hills HOA's complete financial records going back 5 years. What she found was even worse than they'd initially suspected. Linda called James to give him the update.
Rebecca just briefed me on what the financial forensics team found. James, Karen and her husband haven't just been stealing from fraudulent annexations, they've been embezzling from the legitimate HOA as well. That shell company I told you about, it's been billing the HOA for services that were never performed, landscaping that was never done, repairs that never happened, security patrols that don't exist. Over the past 5 years, they've stolen approximately $500,000 from the HOA and its members. $500,000, James repeated, stunned. At least, Linda confirmed. And it gets better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. Rebecca has enough evidence now to charge Karen and David with multiple felonies: fraud, forgery, embezzlement, identity theft for using homeowners' names without permission, filing false police reports, and conspiracy. We're talking decades in prison if they're convicted on all counts. When are they making arrests? James asked. Soon, Linda said. Rebecca wants to coordinate with the sheriff's department to execute search warrants on the Millers' home and business offices at the same time they make the arrests. They're planning it carefully so Karen doesn't have time to destroy evidence. But James, here's where it gets interesting. Rebecca asked me if you'd be willing to help with something. What's that? She wants to catch Karen in the act of harassment one more time. She thinks if we can get Karen to make explicit threats or attempt another fraudulent action while under surveillance, it'll make the case even stronger and prevent any claims that this was all a misunderstanding. Would you be comfortable with that? James thought about all the harassment, all the fake notices, all the intimidation Karen had put him and other innocent people through. He thought about elderly Margaret, who'd been paying fraudulent dues for 2 years because she was too scared to fight back. Tell Rebecca I'm in, James said. What do I need to do?
Setting the trap. The plan Rebecca Torres devised was straightforward but required careful timing. James would send a formal letter to Karen Miller, drafted by his attorney, explicitly stating that his property was not part of the HOA, that all previous notices were rejected as fraudulent, and that any further harassment would result in legal action. The goal was to provoke Karen into one final, desperate attempt to assert her authority, an attempt that would be thoroughly documented by law enforcement. Linda drafted the letter, making it professionally firm, but also designed to push Karen's buttons. It referenced the fraudulent annexation documents, stated that authorities had been contacted, and demanded that Karen cease all contact with James's property immediately. They sent the letter via certified mail, ensuring there would be proof that Karen had received it. 2 days later, Karen exploded. James was working in his garage workshop when his phone buzzed with an alert from his security cameras. He checked the feed and saw Karen's black Lexus pulling up to his house, followed by a county code enforcement vehicle. James smiled grimly. She'd brought reinforcements. He walked out to his driveway to find Karen already out of her car, clutching Linda's letter in one hand and gesturing angrily with the other. She was talking to Bill Stevens, the code enforcement officer who had become unfortunately familiar with James over the past month. "Bill?" James greeted him calmly. "What can I do for you today?" Bill looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry about this, but Ms. Miller filed an emergency complaint alleging that you're constructing an unauthorized structure in your garage that violates building codes. I'm required to follow up on emergency complaints within 24 hours. "Of course," James said pleasantly. "I'm not constructing anything, but you're welcome to look. Would you like to see the garage?" Karen interjected before Bill could respond. "This is about more than the garage. This letter I received is threatening and inappropriate. You cannot refuse to comply with HOA regulations. I have legal authority over this property, and I demand that you acknowledge that immediately." James turned to Karen, keeping his expression neutral. "Ms. Miller, as the letter states, this property is not and has never been part of your HOA. The annexation documents you provided are fraudulent. I've provided proof of this to the county and to law enforcement. I'm asking you, for the final time, to leave my property alone." "You can't just ignore the law," Karen shouted, her face reddening. "I have documentation. I have authority. You're going to pay every cent you owe in dues and fines, or I will place a lien on this property and force a foreclosure. Do you understand me?" Bill stepped in, looking alarmed. "Ms. Miller, you need to calm down." "Mr. Mitchell, can I see your garage?" "Absolutely," James said, leading him toward the garage. Karen followed, still ranting. Inside the garage, Bill quickly confirmed there was no unauthorized construction, just some basic woodworking tools and a partially built workbench. He turned to Karen. "There's no violation here, Ms. Miller. I don't know what you reported, but the violation is that he didn't get HOA approval before starting this project. All construction, including interior garage modifications, require architectural committee approval." "Ma'am," his patience clearly wearing thin, "I've told you before I enforce county building codes, not HOA rules. This property isn't even in your HOA according to county records, and even if it was, HOA disputes are civil matters that don't involve my department." Karen's expression turned desperate. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling frantically. "I have proof. I have the annexation documents right here. I'm sending them to you right now." She tapped her phone, apparently forwarding documents to Bill. But what she didn't know was that Rebecca Torres, the assistant district attorney, had obtained a warrant to monitor Karen's electronic communications as part of the fraud investigation. The documents Karen was sending, the same forged annexation documents she'd given James weeks earlier, were being intercepted and documented as evidence in real time. Bill's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then at Karen, then at James. "Ms. Miller, I'm going to need you to leave Mr. Mitchell's property now. This is not a code enforcement matter." "I'm not leaving until he agrees to comply," Karen shouted. "I have spent years building this community's standards. I will not let some newcomer who doesn't understand how things work here undermine everything I've—" She stopped mid-sentence as two sheriff's department vehicles pulled up to the house, lights flashing but sirens off. Rebecca Torres stepped out of one vehicle, followed by two deputies. She'd been parked around the corner, waiting for the signal from Bill Stevens that Karen had shown up. "Karen Miller?" Rebecca asked, approaching with her identification out. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Torres. I have a warrant for your arrest." The color drained from Karen's face. "What? This is ridiculous. On what charges?" "Multiple counts of fraud, forgery of government documents, embezzlement, extortion, filing false police reports, and conspiracy," Rebecca said calmly, nodding to one of the deputies who began handcuffing Karen. "You have the right to remain silent." As Rebecca read Karen her Miranda rights, James watched the woman who had spent weeks making his life miserable finally facing consequences for her actions. Karen went from shocked disbelief to anger to desperate pleading to threats of lawsuits, all in the span of about 90 seconds. "This is a setup," she screamed as the deputy guided her toward the parked car. "You can't do this. I'm an HOA president. I have rights. I'm going to sue all of you. This is harassment." The irony of her claiming harassment wasn't lost on anyone present.
The legal process. The legal process moved forward with the methodical pace of the criminal justice system. Karen and David Miller were released on bond with strict conditions, including surrender of their passports and prohibition from any contact with HOA members or their victims. Karen's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, arguing that she'd been under stress, that she'd made mistakes but hadn't intended to defraud anyone, and that she'd built the Ridgeview Hills community into a desirable neighborhood. Rebecca Torres rejected the initial plea offer outright. "Your client engaged in systematic fraud over a period of years," Rebecca told Karen's attorney in a pre-trial meeting that was later described in court filings. "She forged government documents, filed false police reports, intimidated elderly victims, and stole $750,000. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was organized crime." The evidence against the Millers was overwhelming. In addition to the forged documents, the victim testimony, and the financial records, investigators found Karen's personal records that essentially served as a how-to guide for her fraud scheme. On her computer, they found a spreadsheet tracking which homeowners outside the HOA boundaries were most vulnerable to her tactics: elderly residents, people new to the area, single women, anyone who seemed unlikely to have resources to fight back. She'd actually rated potential victims on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how likely they were to comply.
They also found email correspondence between Karen and David discussing the fraud openly. In one particularly damning email, Karen had written to her husband, "Found 2 more properties on Oakmont Street that aren't in the HOA, both owned by elderly owners who probably won't have the energy to fight us. Should be able to add $4,800 a year to our revenue stream." When presented with this evidence, Karen's attorney came back to Rebecca with a new plea offer. Karen would plead guilty to 5 counts of fraud, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of embezzlement, and 1 count of conspiracy. In exchange, the remaining charges would be dropped, and Rebecca would recommend a sentence at the lower end of the guidelines. Even with the plea deal, Karen was looking at significant prison time. David Miller, facing similar charges related to his role in the shell company scheme, accepted a separate plea agreement with a recommendation for a shorter sentence based on his more limited involvement. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 months after the arrests, giving time for a comprehensive pre-sentencing investigation and for victims to prepare impact statements.
The victim impact statements. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Dozens of victims attended, along with members of the media and curious members of the public who had followed the case. Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, presided over the hearing. She'd reviewed the extensive case file and made it clear from the outset that she took these crimes seriously. "The court will hear from victims who wish to make impact statements," Judge Morrison announced. "We'll limit each statement to 5 minutes to ensure everyone who wants to speak has an opportunity." James was the first to speak. He approached the podium calmly, the same military bearing that had helped him stand up to Karen in the first place, evident in his posture. "Your Honor," he began, "I'm a 67-year-old retired Navy veteran. I spent 25 years serving my country, and after a long career, I bought what I thought would be my forever home, a place where I could finally relax and enjoy the retirement I'd earned. Instead, I spent months being harassed, intimidated, and threatened by Karen Miller. She filed false police reports against me. She trespassed on my property repeatedly. She attempted to extort thousands of dollars from me using forged documents. But I was lucky. I had resources, I had an attorney, and I had the ability to fight back. Not everyone does." He gestured to the other victims in the courtroom. Some of the people Mrs. Miller targeted were elderly, on fixed incomes, vulnerable. She exploited that vulnerability deliberately and systematically. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated scheme to steal from people she thought were too weak to stop her. I hope this sentence sends a message that elder financial abuse, fraud, and exploitation will not be tolerated in our community. Next came Margaret, the elderly woman Frank had told James about, one of Karen's early victims who had been paying fraudulent dues for over 2 years. Margaret was 78, soft-spoken, and visibly nervous as she approached the podium. "I'm not good at public speaking," she said quietly, "but I want the judge to understand what this did to me. I'm a widow on Social Security. I live on less than $2,000 a month. Karen Miller convinced me that if I didn't pay the HOA dues, I would lose my home, the home my husband and I bought 40 years ago, where I raised my children, where I plan to live until I die. I paid her almost $6,000 that I couldn't afford, money that came from my savings that was supposed to cover medical expenses and emergencies. I went without things I needed because I was terrified of losing my home. When I found out it was all a lie, that she'd stolen from me deliberately, I haven't slept well since. I'm scared all the time now, scared that someone else will try to trick me, scared that I can't trust anyone. What she did to me wasn't just about money. She stole my sense of security and peace." Several other victims spoke, each sharing similar stories of intimidation, financial loss, and emotional trauma. A single mother who had paid over $3,000 in fake fines, a retired school teacher who had been harassed so badly that he'd developed anxiety and high blood pressure, a couple who'd lost $40,000 when they sold their home below market value just to escape Karen's constant harassment. Bill Stevens, the county code enforcement officer, also submitted a written statement that Judge Morrison read into the record.
It detailed the hundreds of hours of county staff time that had been wasted responding to Karen's frivolous complaints and the cost to taxpayers of investigating her false reports. When it was time for Karen to speak, her attorney had prepared a statement expressing remorse and asking for leniency, but Karen, true to form, couldn't help herself. "Your Honor," she said, standing at the defense table, "I understand that I made mistakes in how I managed the HOA finances, but I want the court to know that everything I did was because I cared about the community. I worked tirelessly to maintain property values and standards. The residents of Ridgeview Hills benefited from my leadership. Yes, I made errors in judgment, but I never intended to hurt anyone. I hope the court will consider my years of service to the community when determining my sentence." James, sitting in the gallery, had to restrain himself from laughing at the audacity. Even now, facing prison time, Karen was trying to paint herself as a victim and a community servant. Judge Morrison's expression suggested she wasn't buying it either.
The sentencing. Judge Morrison took a long moment to review her notes before speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression was stern. "Mrs. Miller," she began, "I've been on the bench for 30 years, and I've presided over many fraud cases, but I must say the breadth and calculated nature of your crimes is truly remarkable, and I don't mean that as a compliment." She pulled up a document. "I've reviewed the pre-sentencing investigation report, the victim impact statements, and all the evidence in this case. What emerges is a picture of systematic, deliberate exploitation of vulnerable people over a period of at least 5 years. You didn't make mistakes in judgment as your statement claimed. You created a sophisticated scheme involving forged government documents, identity theft, shell companies, and systematic intimidation. You kept spreadsheets rating your victims by vulnerability. You coordinated with your husband to funnel stolen money through fake businesses. You filed false police reports to weaponize law enforcement against people who resisted you. This was organized crime, Mrs. Miller, plain and simple." Karen's face had gone pale. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, likely warning her to stay quiet. Judge Morrison continued, "What makes your crimes particularly egregious is who you targeted. You specifically sought out elderly victims, people new to the area, single women, anyone you perceived as unable to fight back. You stole Margaret Henderson's medical savings. You drove families from their homes. You created years of fear and anxiety for dozens of innocent people. The pre-sentencing report notes that you've shown limited remorse and continue to minimize your conduct. Your statement today, referring to errors in judgment rather than acknowledging the serious criminal conduct you engaged in, reinforces that assessment." She turned to a new page. "The sentencing guidelines for your charges, taking into account the amount of loss, the number of victims, and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, recommend a range of 78 to 97 months in federal prison. The prosecution has recommended the low end of that range based on your guilty plea." Her attorney leaned forward, hopeful. "However," Judge Morrison said, "the court is not bound by that recommendation. And given the aggravating factors in this case, the vulnerability of your victims, the abuse of a position of trust, the duration of the scheme, and your lack of genuine remorse, I find that a sentence at the low end would not adequately reflect the seriousness of your crimes or provide adequate deterrence. Karen Miller, you are hereby sentenced to 90 months, 7.5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $742,000 to your victims, with payment to be distributed according to a schedule to be determined by the court's probation office." Karen collapsed into her chair, crying. Her attorney was already making notes for an appeal. Judge Morrison turned to David Miller. "Mr. Miller, while your role was more limited than your wife's, you were a willing participant in this scheme. You created the shell company that was used to launder stolen funds. You benefited financially from your wife's crimes. You are sentenced to 48 months, 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release.
You are jointly and severally liable with your wife for the full restitution amount. David, who had been hoping for probation, looked stunned. Additionally, as a condition of your supervised release, both of you are permanently barred from serving in any position of authority with any community organization or similar entity. You will also be required to perform 500 hours of community service upon release, specifically working with programs that assist victims of financial fraud. She brought down her gavel. This court is adjourned. As the marshals were preparing to take Karen and David into custody, they'd be allowed a few weeks to get their affairs in order before reporting to prison. James felt a profound sense of relief. It was finally over.
Aftermath and rebuilding. The weeks and months following the sentencing brought significant changes to both the Ridgeview Hills community and the surrounding neighborhoods that Karen had targeted. The Ridgeview Hills HOA underwent a complete restructuring. An interim board was appointed by the court to manage the association's affairs while a proper election could be organized. The new leadership immediately implemented transparency measures, monthly financial reports, open board meetings, limits on board member authority, and clear procedures for any rule changes or assessments. The HOA's assets, including the money recovered from the Millers, were placed in a court-supervised trust to ensure proper distribution to victims. Each homeowner who had paid dues during Karen's tenure received a check for $6,200, her stolen dues plus interest. When a local news crew interviewed her about receiving the money, she cried tears of relief. "I didn't think I'd ever see this money again," she said. "It means I can afford my medications this year without worrying. It means I can sleep at night knowing that justice was done." The properties that Karen had fraudulently annexed, including James's, received formal written acknowledgments from the newly formed HOA board that they were not and had never been part of the association, along with apologies for the harassment they'd endured. James used the settlement money he received, about $3,500, to cover his attorney fees and compensate for the harassment to complete his workshop and garden. But more importantly, the stress and constant harassment ended. He could finally enjoy his retirement. His friendship with Frank deepened, and they became regular fixtures at a local veterans coffee group where they often shared the story of how they'd taken down a corrupt HOA president. Other veterans loved the tale, and it became something of a legend in the local vet community. The county also implemented changes based on what had happened. The clerk's office upgraded their document security to make forgeries more difficult. The Code Enforcement Department created a new protocol for flagging repeat complainants who might be abusing the system. And the Sheriff's Department created a financial crimes task force specifically to investigate HOA and community association fraud. Rebecca Torres, the assistant DA who had prosecuted the case, used it as a launching point for a broader initiative to protect seniors from financial exploitation. She gave presentations at senior centers and community groups about recognizing financial scams and knowing where to turn for help. As for James, he finally got to experience the retirement he'd dreamed of. His garden flourished, producing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that he shared with neighbors. His workshop became a space where he built furniture and birdhouses, sometimes donating pieces to local charities. He adopted a dog, a golden retriever mix from the shelter that he named Admiral, and the two of them became a common sight on evening walks around the neighborhood. And perhaps most satisfying of all, James's property value increased significantly. Turns out that living next to a community that had cleaned up its corruption and established transparent, fair governance made the whole area more desirable. And that brings us to the end of this incredible story, folks. Karen Miller, the HOA president who thought she was untouchable, is currently serving her sentence in federal prison. David Miller is in a separate facility, also serving his time. Both will eventually be released, but their reputations are destroyed, their assets seized, and they're permanently banned from ever holding positions of authority in community organizations again. Meanwhile, James Mitchell is living his best retirement life, proving that sometimes standing up to bullies, even ones with clipboards and fake authority, is absolutely worth it. The lesson here is clear.
Documentation is your friend. Know your legal rights, and never underestimate the determination of a military veteran with time on his hands and a good attorney on speed dial. Karen Miller thought she could intimidate a 67-year-old retiree into submission. She thought wrong. She forgot that people who've spent decades serving their country don't scare easily, and that justice, while sometimes slow, has a long memory and a firm hand. If you enjoyed this story, please smash that like button and subscribe to the Karen Stories for more tales of entitled behavior meeting consequences. Drop a comment and let me know, have you ever dealt with HOA overreach or fraud? What did you do about it? And remember, if you ever find yourself being harassed by an HOA or any organization claiming authority they don't actually have, document everything, consult an attorney, and don't be afraid to stand your ground. The law is on the side of property owners, not power-hungry tyrants with forged documents. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay strong, know your rights, and never let anyone make you feel like a trespasser on your own property.